The Fellowship of the Ring, Book 1, Chapter 1, A Long-Expected Party. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Bilbo was very rich and very peculiar, and he'd been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since his remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. The riches he had brought back from his travels had now become a local legend, and it was popularly believed, whatever the old folk might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasure. And if that wasn't enough for fame, there was also his prolonged vigor to marvel at. Time wore on, but it seemed to have little effect on Mr. Baggins. At 90, he was much the same as at 50. At 99, they began to call him well preserved, but unchanged would have been nearer the mark. There were some that shook their heads and thought this was too much of a good thing. It seemed unfair that anyone should possess, apparently, perpetual youth, as well as, reputedly, inexhaustible wealth. "It'll have to be paid for," they said. "It isn't natural. Trouble will come of it." But so far trouble had not come, and as Mr. Baggins was generous with his money, most people were willing to forgive him his oddities and his good fortune. He remained on visiting terms with his relatives, except, of course, the Sackville Bagginses, and he had many devoted admirers among the hobbits of poor and unimportant families. But he had no close friends until some of his younger cousins began to grow up. The eldest of these, and Bilbo's favorite, was young Frodo Baggins. When Bilbo was 99, he adopted Frodo as his heir, and he brought him to live at Bag End, and the hopes of the Sackville Bagginses were finally dashed. Bilbo and Frodo happened to have the same birthday, September the 22nd. "You'd better come and live with here, Frodo, my lad," said Bilbo one day. "Then we can celebrate our birthday parties comfortably together." At that time, Frodo was still in his tweens, as the hobbits call the irresponsible 20s, between childhood and coming of age at 33. 12 more years passed. Each year the Bagginses had given very lively combined birthday parties at Bag End, but now it was understood that something quite exceptional was being planned for that autumn. Bilbo was going to be 111, a rather curious number, and a very respectable age for a hobbit, while the old Took himself had only reached 130. And Frodo was going to be 33. 33, an important number, the date of his coming of age. Tongues began to wag in Hobbiton and Bywater, and rumor of the coming event traveled all over the Shire. The history and the character of Mr. Bilbo Baggins became once again the chief topic of conversation, and the older folk suddenly found their reminiscences were in welcome demand. No one had a more attentive audience than old Ham Gamgee, commonly known as the Gaffer. He held forth at the Ivy Bush, a small inn on the Bywater Road, and he spoke with some authority, for he had tended the garden at Bag End for 40 years, and he'd helped old Holman in the same job before that. Now that he was himself growing old and stiff in the joints, the job was mainly carried on by his youngest son, Sam Gamgee. Both father and son were on very friendly terms with Bilbo and Frodo. They lived on the hill itself, in number 3 Bagshot Row, just below Bag End. A nice, well-spoken, gentle hobbit is Mr. Bilbo, as I've always said, the gaffer declared. With perfect truth, for Bilbo was very polite to him, calling him Master Handfast, and consulting him constantly on the growing of vegetables. In the matter of roots, especially potatoes, the gaffer was recognized as the leading authority in all the neighborhood, including himself. "But what about this Frodo that lives with him?" asked old Noakes of Bywater. "Baggins is his name, but he's more than half a brandy-buck, they say. Beats me why any Baggins of Hobbiton should go looking for a wife away there in Buckland, where folks are so queer." "And no wonder they're queer," put in Daddy Two-Foot, the gaffer's next-door neighbor. "If they live on the wrong side of the Brandywine River and right up against the old forest, why, that's a dark, bad place if half the tales be true." "You're right, Dad," said Gaffer. "Not but that the Brandy-Bucks of Buckland live in the old forest, but they are a queer breed, seemingly. They fool around with boats on that big river, and that ain't natural. Small wonder trouble came of it, I say. But be that as it may, Mr. Frodo is as nice a young hobbit as you could wish to meet, very much like Mr. Bilbo, and in more than just looks. After all, his father was a Baggins. A decent, respectable hobbit was Mr. Drogo Baggins. There was never much to tell of him till he was drownded." "Drownded?" said several voices. Now, they'd heard this and other darker rumors before, of course, but hobbits have a passion for family history, and they were ready to hear it all again. "Well, so they say," said the gaffer. "You see, Mr. Drogo, he married poor Miss Primula Brandybuck. Now, she was our Mr. Bilbo's first cousin on the mother's side, her mother being the youngest of the old Took's daughters. And Mr. Drogo was his second cousin. So Mr. Frodo is his first and second cousin, once removed either way, as the saying goes, if you follow me. And Mr. Drogo, why, he was staying at Brandy Hall with his father-in-law, old Master Gorbodoc, as he often did after his marriage, him being partial to his victuals and old Gorbodoc keeping a mighty generous table. And he went out boating on the Brandywine River, and he and his wife were drownded, and poor Mr. Frodo was only a child and all. I've heard they went out on the water after dinner in the moonlight," said old Noakes, "and it was Drogo's weight as sunk the boat." "And I heard she pushed him in, and he pulled her in after him," said Sandyman, the Hobbiton miller. "But you shouldn't listen to all you hear, Sandyman," said the gaffer, who didn't much like the miller. "There isn't no call to go talking of pushing and pulling. Boats are quite tricky enough for those that sit still without looking further for the cause of trouble. Anyway, there was this Mr. Frodo, left an orphan, and stranded, as you might say, among those queer Bucklanders, being brought up anyhow in Brandy Hall, a regular warren by all accounts. Old Master Gorbodoc never had fewer than a couple of 100 relations in the place. Mr. Bilbo never did a kinder deed than when he brought the lad back to live among decent folk. I reckon it was a nasty knock for those Sackville Bagginses. They thought they was going to get Bag End that time when he went off and was thought to be dead. And then he comes back and he orders them off, and he goes on living and living and never looking a day older, bless him. And suddenly he produces an heir, and he has all the papers made out proper. The Sackville Bagginses won't never see the inside of Bag End now, or so it is to be hoped. There's a tidy bit of money tucked away up there, I hear tell, said a stranger, a visitor on business from nickel delving in the West Riding. All the top of your hills full of tunnels, packed with chests of gold and silver and jewels, by what I've heard." "Well, and you've heard more than I can speak to," said the gaffer. "I know nothing about jewels. Mr. Bilbo's free with his money. There seems to be no lack of it, but I know of no tunnel making. I saw Mr. Bilbo when he came back, matter of 60 years ago when I was a lad. I'd not long come to prentice to old Holman, him being my dad's cousin, but he had me up at Bag End helping him to keep the folks from trampling and trespassing all over the garden while the sale was going on, and in the middle of it all, Mr. Bilbo comes up the hill with a pony and some mighty big bags and a couple of chests. I don't doubt they was mostly full of treasure he'd picked up in foreign parts, where there be mountains of gold, they say, but there wasn't enough to fill tunnels. My lad Sam would know more about that. He's in and out of Bag End. Crazy about stories of the old days, he is, and he listens to all of Mr. Bilbo's tales. Mr. Bilbo learned him his letters, meaning no harm, mark you, and I hope no harm will come of it. 'Elves and dragons,' I says to him. 'Cabbages and potatoes is better for me and you. Don't go getting mixed up in the business of your betters, or you'll land in trouble too big for you,' I says to him. And I might say it to others," he added, with a look at the stranger and the miller. The gaffer didn't convince his audience. The legend of Bilbo's wealth was now too firmly fixed in the minds of the younger generation of hobbits. "No, but he was likely enough to be adding to what he brought at first," argued the miller, voicing a common opinion. "He's often away from home, and look at the outlandish folk that visit him. Dwarves coming at night, and that old wandering conjurer Gandalf and all. You can say what you like, gaffer, but Bag End's a queer place, and its folks are queerer." "And you can say what you like about what you don't know no more about than you do of boating, Mr. Sandyman," retorted the gaffer, disliking the miller even more than usual. "If that's being queer, then we could do with a bit more queerness in these parts. There's some not far away that wouldn't give a pint of beer to a friend if they lived in a hole with golden walls. But they do things proper at Bag End. Our Sam says everyone's going to be invited to the party, and there's going to be presents, mark you, presents for all, this very month as is." That very month was September, and as fine as you could ask. A day or two later, a rumor, probably started by the knowledgeable Sam, was spread about that there was going to be fireworks. Fireworks, what is more, such as had not been seen in the Shire for nigh on to a century, nor indeed since the old Took died. Days passed, the day drew nearer. An odd-looking wagon, laden with odd-looking packages, rolled into Hobbiton one evening and toiled up the hill to Bag End. The startled hobbits peered out of the lamp-lit doors to gape at it. It was driven by outlandish folk, singing strange songs, dwarves with long beards and deep hoods. A few of them remained at Bag End. At the end of the second week in September, a cart came in through Bywater from the direction of Brandywine Bridge in broad daylight. An old man was driving it all alone. He wore a tall, pointed blue hat, a long gray cloak, and a silver scarf. He had a long white beard and bushy eyebrows that stuck out beyond the brim of his hat. Small hobbit children ran after the cart all through Hobbiton and right up the hill. It had a cargo of fireworks, as they rightly guessed. At Bilbo's door, the old man began to unload. There were great bundles of fireworks of all sorts and shapes. each labeled with a large red G and an elf rune. That was Gandalf's mark, of course, and the old man was Gandalf, the wizard, whose fame in the Shire was due mainly to his skill with fires, smokes, and lights. His real business was far more difficult and dangerous, but the Shire folk knew nothing about it. To them, he was just one of the attractions of the party. Hence the excitement of the Hobbit children. "Gee, for grand!" they yelled, and the old man smiled. They knew him by sight, though he only appeared in Hobbiton occasionally, and he never stopped long. But neither they nor any but the oldest of their elders had ever seen one of his firework displays. They now belonged to a legendary past. When the old man, helped by Bilbo and some dwarves, had finished unloading, Bilbo gave a few pennies away, but not a single squib or firecracker was forthcoming, to the disappointment of the onlookers. "Run away now," said Gandalf. "You'll get plenty when the time comes." Then he disappeared inside with Bilbo, and the door was shut. The young hobbits stared at the door in vain for a while, and then they made off, feeling that the day of the party would never come. Inside Bag End, Bilbo and Gandalf were sitting at the open window of a small room looking out west onto the garden. The late afternoon was bright and peaceful. The flowers glowed, red and golden, snapdragons and sunflowers, and nasturtiums trailing all over the turf walls and peeping in at the round windows. "How bright your garden looks," said Gandalf. "Yes," said Bilbo, "I'm very fond of it indeed, and of all the dear old Shire. But I think I need a holiday." "You mean to go on with your plan, then?" "I do. I made up my mind months ago, and I haven't changed it." "Very well. It's no good saying any more. Stick to your plan. Your whole plan, mind you. And I hope it will turn out for the best, for you and for all of us." "I hope so. Anyway, I mean to enjoy myself on Thursday, and I'll have my little joke." "Who will laugh, I wonder?" said Gandalf, shaking his head. "We shall see," said Bilbo. The next day more carts rolled up the hill, and still more carts. There might have been some grumbling about dealing locally, but that very week orders began to pour out of Bag End for every kind of provision, commodity, or luxury that could be obtained in Hobbiton or Bywater or anywhere in the neighborhood. People became enthusiastic. They began to tick off the days on the calendar, and they began to watch eagerly for the postman, hoping for invitations. Before long, the invitations began pouring out, and the Hobbiton post office was blocked, and the Bywater post office was snowed under with them, and voluntary assistant postmen were called for. There was a constant stream of them going up the hill, carrying hundreds of polite variations on "Thank you, I shall certainly come." A notice appeared on the gate at Bag End: "No admittance except on party business." Even those who had or pretended to have party business were seldom allowed inside. Bilbo was busy, writing invitations, ticking off answers, packing up presents, making some private preparations of his own. From the time of Gandalf's arrival, he remained hidden from view. One morning the hobbits woke to find the large field south of Bilbo's front door covered with ropes and poles for tents and pavilions. A special entrance was cut into the bank leading to the road, and wide steps and a large white gate were built there. The 3 hobbit families of Bagshot Row, adjoining the field, were intensely interested and generally envied. Old Gaffer Gamgee stopped even pretending to work in his garden. the tents began to go up. There was an especially large pavilion, so big that the tree that grew in the field was right inside it, and stood proudly near one end at the head of the chief table. Lanterns were hung on all the branches of the tree. More promising still to the hobbit's mind, an enormous open-air kitchen was erected in the north corner of the field. A draft of cooks from every inn and eating house for miles around arrived to help the dwarves and the other odd folk that were quartered at Bag End. Excitement rose to its height. Then the weather clouded over. That was on Wednesday, the eve of the party. Anxiety was intense. Then Thursday, September the 22nd, actually dawned. The sun got up, the clouds vanished, flags were unfurled, and the fun began. Bilbo Baggins called it a party, but it was really a variety of entertainments rolled into one. Practically everybody living near was invited. A very few were overlooked by accident, but as they turned up all the same, that didn't matter. Many people from other parts of the Shire were also asked, and there were even a few from outside the borders. Bilbo met the guests and the additions at the new White Gate in person. He gave away presents to all and sundry. The latter were those who went out again by a back way and came in again by the gate. Hobbits give presents to other people on their own birthdays. Not very expensive ones as a rule, and not so lavishly as on this occasion, but it wasn't a bad system. Actually, in Hobbiton and Bywater, every day of the year was somebody's birthday, so that every hobbit in those parts had a fair chance of at least one present at least once a week, but they never got tired of them. On this occasion, the presents were unusually good. The hobbit children were so excited that for a while they almost forgot about eating. There were toys, the like of which they had never seen before, all beautiful and some obviously magical. Many of them had indeed been ordered a year before and had come all the way from the mountain and from Dale and were of real dwarf make. When every guest had been welcomed and was finally inside the gate, there were songs, dances, music, games, and, of course, food and drink. There were 3 official meals: lunch, tea, and dinner, or supper. But lunch and tea were marked chiefly by the fact that at those times all the guests were sitting down and eating together. At other times there were merely lots of people eating and drinking continuously from 11s until 6:30 when the fireworks started. The fireworks were by Gandalf, and they were not only brought by him but designed and made by him, and the special effects, the set pieces, the flights of rockets were let off by him. But there was also a generous distribution of squibs, those are tiny little firecrackers, crackers, bacca-wrappers, sparklers, torches, dwarf candles, elf fountains, goblin barkers, and thunderclaps, and they were all superb. The art of Gandalf improved with age. There were rockets like a flight of scintillating birds singing with sweet voices. There were green trees with trunks of dark smoke. Their leaves opened like a whole spring unfolding in a moment, and their shining branches dropped glowing flowers down upon the astonished hobbits, disappearing with a sweet scent just before they touched their upturned faces. There were fountains of butterflies that flew glittering into the trees. There were pillars of colored fires that rose and turned into eagles or sailing ships, or a phalanx of flying swans. There was a red thunderstorm and a shower of yellow rain. There was a forest of silver spears that sprang suddenly into the air with a yell like an embattled army, and came down again into the water with a hiss like 100 hot snakes. And there was also one last surprise in honor of Bilbo, and it startled the hobbits exceedingly, as Gandalf intended. The lights went out. A great smoke went up. It shaped itself like a mountain seen in the distance, and it began to glow at the summit. It spouted green and scarlet flames. Out flew a red golden dragon, not life-size, but terribly lifelike. Fire came from his jaws, his eyes glared down. There was a roar, and he whizzed 3 times over the heads of the crowd. They all ducked, and many fell flat on their faces. The dragon passed like an express train, turned a somersault, and burst over Bywater with a deafening explosion. "That's the signal for supper," said Bilbo. The pain and alarm vanished at once, and the prostrate hobbits leaped to their feet. There was a splendid supper for everyone. For everyone, that is, except those invited to the special family-style dinner party. This was held in the great pavilion with the tree. The invitations were limited to 12 dozen, a number also called by the hobbits 1 gross, though the word wasn't considered proper to use when talking of people. And the guests were selected from all the families to which Bilbo and Frodo were related, with the addition of a few special unrelated friends, such as Gandalf. Many young hobbits were included, and present by their parents' permission, for hobbits were easygoing with their children in the matter of sitting up late, especially when there was a chance of getting them a free meal. Bringing up young hobbits took a lot of food. There were many Bagginses and Boffins, and also many Tooks and Brandybucks. There were various Grubbs, relations of Bilbo Baggins' grandmother, various Chubbs, connections of his Took grandfather, a selection of Burrowses, Bolgers, Bracegirdles, Brockhouses, Goodbodies, Hornblowers, and Proudfoots. Some of these were only very distantly connected with Bilbo, and some had hardly ever been in Hobbiton before, as they lived in remote corners of the Shire. The Sackville Bagginses were not forgotten. Otho and his wife Lobelia were present. They disliked Bilbo and detested Frodo. But so magnificent was the invitation card, written in golden ink, they felt it was impossible to refuse to come. Besides, their cousin, Bilbo, had been specializing in food for many years, and his table had a high reputation. All of the 144 guests expected a pleasant feast, though they rather dreaded the after-dinner speech of their host. He was liable to drag in bits of what he called poetry, and sometimes after a glass or two he would allude to the absurd adventures of his mysterious journey. The guests were not disappointed. They had a very pleasant feast, in fact an engrossing entertainment, rich, abundant, varied, and prolonged. The purchase of food fell to almost nothing throughout the district in the next week. But as Bilbo's catering had wiped out the stocks of most of the stores, the cellars, and warehouses for miles around, that didn't matter very much. After the feast, more or less, came the speech. Most of the company were, however, in a tolerant mood now, so that delightful stage they called filling up the corners. They were sipping their favorite drinks, nibbling at their favorite dainties, and their fears were forgotten. They were prepared to listen to anything and cheer at every full stop. "My dear people," began Bilbo, rising in his place. "Hear, hear, hear," they shouted, and kept on repeating it in chorus, seeming reluctant to follow their own advice. Bilbo left his place, and he went and stood on a chair under the illuminated tree. The light of the lanterns fell on his beaming face. The golden buttons shone on his embroidered silk waistcoat. They could all see him standing, waving one hand in the air. His other hand was in his trouser pocket. "My dear Bagginses and Boffins," he began again, "and my dear Tooks and Brandybucks, and Grubbs and Chubbs and Boses and Hornblowers and Bolgers, Bracegirdles, Goodbodies, Brockhouses and Proudfoots." "Proud feet!" shouted an elderly hobbit from the back of the pavilion. His name, of course, was Proudfoot, and it was well earned. His feet were large and exceptionally furry, and both of them were on the table. "Proudfoots," repeated Bilbo. "Also my good Sackville Bagginses that I welcome back at last to Bag End. Today is my 111th birthday. I am 11y today. Hooray! Hooray! Many happy returns!" they all shouted, and they hammered joyously on the tables. Bilbo was doing splendidly. This was just the sort of stuff they liked, short and obvious. "I hope you are all enjoying yourselves as much as I am." Deafening cheers, cries of "yes" and "no." Noises of trumpets and horns, pipes and flutes and other musical instruments. There were, as has been said, many young hobbits present. Hundreds of musical crackers had been pulled. Most of them bore the mark Dale on them, which didn't convey very much to most of the hobbits. They were all agreed that they were marvelous party crackers. They had little instruments in them, small but perfectly made and with enchanting tones. Indeed, in one corner, some of the young Tooks and Brandybucks, thinking that Uncle Bilbo must have finished his speech since he plainly said everything that was necessary, now got up an impromptu orchestra and began a merry dance tune. Master Everard Took and Miss Meliot Brandybuck got up on a table and with bells in their hands began to dance the Springle Ring, a pretty dance, but rather vigorous. But Bilbo hadn't finished. Seizing a horn from a youngster nearby, he blew 3 loud hoots. The noise subsided. "I shall not keep you long," he cried. Cheers from all the assembly. "I have called you all together for a purpose." Something in the way he said this made an impression. There was almost silence, and 1 or 2 of the Tooks pricked up their ears. "Indeed, for 3 purposes. First of all, to tell you that I am immensely fond of you all, and that 11y years is too short a time to live among such excellent and admirable hobbits." Tremendous outburst of approval. "I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve." Now this was unexpected and rather difficult. There was some scattered clapping, but most of them were trying to work it out in their heads to see if it came to a compliment. "Secondly, to celebrate my birthday." More cheers. "I should say our birthday, for it is, of course, also the birthday of my heir and nephew Frodo. He comes of age and into his inheritance today." Some clapping by the elders, some loud shouts of "Frodo! Frodo! Good old Frodo!" from the juniors. The Sackville Bagginses frowned and wondered what was meant by coming into his inheritance. "Together we are 144. Your numbers were chosen to fit this remarkable total. 1 gross, if I may use the expression." No cheers. This was ridiculous. Many of the guests, and especially the Sackville Bagginses, were insulted. feeling sure they'd only been asked to fill up the required numbers like goods in a package, one gross, indeed vulgar expression. It is also, if I may be allowed to refer to ancient history, the anniversary of my arrival by barrel at Esgaroth on the Long Lake, although the fact that it was my birthday slipped my memory on that occasion. I was only 51 then, and birthdays didn't seem so important. The banquet was very splendid, however, though I had a bad cold at the time, I remember, and could only say, "Thank you very much." I repeat it more correctly. Thank you very much for coming to my little party. Obstinate silence. They all feared that a song or some poetry was now about to come, and they were getting bored. Why couldn't he stop talking and let them drink to his health? But Bilbo didn't sing or recite poetry. He paused for a moment. "Thirdly, and finally," he said, "I wish to make an announcement." He spoke this last word so loudly and suddenly that everyone sat up who still could. "I regret to announce that though, as I said, 11 years is too short a time to spend among you, this is the end. I am going. I am leaving. Now! Goodbye!" He stepped down and vanished. There was a blinding flash of light, and all the guests blinked, and when they opened their eyes, Bilbo was nowhere to be seen. 144 flabbergasted hobbits sat back speechless. Old Odo Proudfoot removed his feet from the table and stamped. Then there was a dead silence, until suddenly, after several deep breaths, every Baggins, Boffin, Took, Brandybuck, Grubb, Chubb, Burrows, Bolger, Bracegirdle, Brockhouse, Goodbody, Hornblower, and Proudfoot began to talk at once. It was generally agreed that the joke was in very bad taste, and more food and drink were needed to cure the guests of their shock and annoyance. "He's mad. I always said so," was probably the most popular comment. Even the Tooks, with a few exceptions, thought Bilbo's behavior was absurd. For the moment, most of them took it for granted that his disappearance was nothing more than a ridiculous prank. But old Rory Brandybuck wasn't so sure. Neither age nor an enormous dinner had clouded his wits, and he said to his daughter-in-law Esmeralda, "There's something fishy in this, my dear. I believe that mad Baggins is off again. Silly old fool. But why worry? He hasn't taken the victuals with him." And he called loudly to Frodo to send the wine around again. Frodo was the only one present who had said nothing. For some time he had sat silent beside Bilbo's empty chair and ignored all remarks and questions. He'd enjoyed the joke, of course, even though he'd been in the know about it. He had difficulty in keeping from laughing at the indignant surprise of the guests, but at the same time he felt deeply troubled. He realized suddenly that he loved the old hobbit dearly. Most of the guests went on eating and drinking and discussing Bilbo Baggins' oddities, past and present. But the Sackville Bagginses had already departed in wrath. Frodo didn't want to have any more to do with the party. He gave orders for more wine to be served, and then he got up, drained his own glass silently to the health of Bilbo, and slipped out of the pavilion. As for Bilbo Baggins, even while he was making his speech, he had been fingering the golden ring in his pocket, his magic ring that he had kept secret for so many years. As he stepped down, he slipped it on his finger, and he was never seen by any hobbit in Hobbiton again. He walked briskly back to his hole, and he stood for a moment listening with a smile to the din in the pavilion and the sounds of merrymaking in other parts of the field. Then he went in. He took off his party clothes, folded up and wrapped in tissue paper his embroidered silk waistcoat, and put it away. Then he put on quickly some old, untidy garments, and he fastened around his waist a worn leather belt. And on the belt he hung a short sword in a battered black leather scabbard. From a locked drawer smelling of mothballs, he took out an old cloak and hood. They had been locked up as if they were very precious, but they were so patched and weather-stained that their original color could hardly be guessed. It might have been dark green. They were rather too large for him. He then went into his study, and from a large strong box he took out a bundle wrapped in old cloth and a leather-bound manuscript, and also a large, bulky envelope. The book and the bundle he stuffed into the top of a heavy bag that was standing there already nearly full. Into the envelope he slipped his golden ring and its fine chain, and then he sealed it, and he addressed it to Frodo. At first he put it on the mantelpiece, but suddenly he removed it and stuck it in his pocket. At that moment the door opened, and Gandalf came quickly in. "Hello," said Bilbo. "I wondered if you'd turn up." "I'm glad to find you visible," said the wizard, sitting down in the chair. "I wanted to catch you and have a few final words. I suppose you feel everything's gone off splendidly and according to plan." "Well, yes, I do," said Bilbo. "Though that flash was surprising, it quite startled me, let alone the others. A little addition of your own, I suppose." "It was," said Gandalf. "You have wisely kept that ring secret all these years, and it seemed to me necessary to give your guest something else that would seem to explain your sudden vanishment." "And would spoil my joke. You're an interfering old busybody," laughed Bilbo, "but I expect you know best, as usual." "I do, when I know anything. But I don't feel too sure about this whole affair. It's now come to the final point. You've had your joke. You've alarmed or offended most of your relations. You've given the whole Shire something to talk about for 9 days, or 99 more likely. Are you going any further?" "Yes, I am. I feel I need a holiday. A very long holiday, as I told you before. Probably a permanent holiday. I don't expect I shall return. In fact, I don't mean to, and I've made all the arrangements. I'm old, Gandalf. I don't look it, but I'm beginning to feel it in my heart of hearts. Well preserved, indeed," he snorted. "Why, I feel all thin, sort of stretched, if you know what I mean, like butter that's been scraped over too much bread. That can't be right. I need a change or something." Gandalf looked curiously and closely at him. "No, it doesn't seem right," he said thoughtfully. "No, after all, I believe your plan is probably the best. Well, I've made up my mind anyway. I want to see mountains again, Gandalf. Mountains! And then find somewhere where I can rest. Peace and quiet without a lot of relatives prying around and a string of confounded visitors hanging on the bell. I might find somewhere where I can finish my book. I've thought of a nice ending for it. And he lived happily ever after to the end of his days." Gandalf laughed. "I hope he will. But nobody will read the book, however it ends." "Oh, they may, in years to come. Frodo's read some already, as far as it's gone. You will keep an eye on Frodo, won't you?" "Yes, I will. 2 eyes, as often as I can spare them." He would come with me, of course, if I asked him. In fact, he offered to once, just before the party. But he doesn't really want to yet. I want to see the wild country again before I die, and the mountains. But he is still in love with the Shire, with woods and fields and little rivers. He ought to be comfortable here. I'm leaving everything to him, of course, except for a few oddments. I hope he will be happy when he gets used to being on his own. It's time he was his own master now. Everything, said Gandalf. The ring as well. You agreed to that, you remember. Yes, I suppose so, stammered Bilbo. Where is it? In an envelope, if you must know, said Bilbo impatiently. There, on the mantelpiece. Well, no, I have it here in my pocket. He hesitated. Ah, isn't that odd now? He said softly to himself. Yes, after all, why not? Why shouldn't it stay there? Gandalf looked very hard at Bilbo. There was a gleam in his eyes. I think, Bilbo, he said quietly, I should leave it behind. Don't you want to? Well, yes. No, now it comes to it, I don't like parting with it at all, I may say. And I don't see why I should. Why do you want me to? He asked, and a curious change came over his voice. It was sharp with suspicion and annoyance. You're always badgering me about my ring, but you've never bothered me about the other things I got on my journey. No, but I had to badger you, said Gandalf. I wanted the truth. It was important. Magic rings are, well, they're magical, and they're rare and curious. I was professionally interested in your ring, you may say, and I still am. I should like to know where it is if you go wandering again. Also, I think you have had it quite long enough. You won't need it any more, Bilbo, unless I am quite mistaken. Bilbo flushed, and there was an angry light in his eyes. His kindly face grew hard. Why not? And what business is it of yours anyway to know what I do with my own things? It is my own. I found it. It came to me. Yes, said Gandalf. There's no need to get angry. Well, if I am, it's your fault, said Bilbo. It is mine, I tell you. My own. My precious. Yes, my precious. The wizard's face remained grave and attentive, and only a flicker in his deep eyes showed he was startled, and indeed alarmed. It has been called that before, he said, but not by you. But I say it now, and why not? Even if Gollum said the same once. It's not his now, it's mine, and I shall keep it, I say. Gandalf stood up. He spoke sternly. You will be a fool if you do, Bilbo. You make that clearer with every word you say. It's got too much of a hold on you. Let it go, and then you can go yourself and be free. I'll do as I choose and go as I please, said Bilbo obstinately. Now, my dear hobbit, said Gandalf. All your long life we have been friends, and you owe me something. Come, do as you promised. Give it up. Well, if you want my ring yourself, say so, said Bilbo, but you won't get it. I won't give my precious away, I tell you. And his hand strayed to the hilt of his small sword.